sovereignty was never ceded by the Tasmanian Aboriginals, and thank them for their ongoing important work of caring for land, waterways and culture. And today is the final day of National Reconciliation Week, with its very powerful theme of bridging now to next. And for us at TasCOSS, it's been a real time to reflect, but also to reaffirm our commitment to reconciliation. And we stand with Aboriginal communities across Lutruwita, Tasmania, walking together on the path from acknowledgement to action and from now to what's next. So just before we get started, if I could just remind everybody just to make sure you're on mute during this session. And of course, if you would like to answer a question, you can bring yourself off mute. But while we're listening to Richard, it'd be great to be on mute. So it's my absolute pleasure today to welcome our guest speaker, Professor Richard Eccleston. I'm sure Richard is known to many of you, but he is the Professor of Political Science and the founding director of the Tasmanian Policy Exchange at the University of Tasmania. He is also an experienced academic and research leader, having been the founding director of the Institute for Study of Social Change and the head of politics and policy discipline at UTAS. He's also an internationally recognised researcher and thought leader in the fields of Australian and comparative political economy, with a focus on tax reform, federalism and regional development. And we're very pleased to have Richard join us today, who is going to unpack last week's state budget with a community services lens across it. So welcome, Richard. Just to let you know before Richard starts, if you do have a question, Richard is very happy to take questions during his presentation or at the end. So feel free to either pop a question in the chat or raise your hand and you can ask your question. So if you do ask your question, just a reminder to state your name and the organisation that you're representing today. So thank you, everybody, and over to you, Richard.
Great, thanks, Adrienne, and good morning, everyone. Look, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you all for the really important work that you all do in terms of supporting and providing key services to the Tasmanian community. What is it? The time's flying. We're 5 days since the budget, so we've seen some of the sort of top line reporting of the kind of top line outcomes and some analysis. So I thought I'd cover some of that briefly, a slightly deeper dive into some of the key sort of portfolio areas that are so important to us all, and particularly to the Tasmanian community sector. And then I thought perhaps starting a conversation that really is designed as a conversation about, where to from here. What are the most effective ways to address the challenges that we're clearly facing on a budget front, but at the same time making sure that we can provide services and support and promote wellbeing and equity and inclusion across Tasmania. So I'll go through a few slides, but as Adrienne said, feel free to come in and post any questions on chat. So I'll just test the technology and see if I can share from my end. Is that coming through okay, Adrienne? So we all know why we're here. I too would like to acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal community as the traditional custodians of Lutruwita, Tasmania. And also like to acknowledge many of you who work very, very hard to promote Aboriginal inclusion and justice and help with that ongoing and very difficult challenge around closing the gap. Also like to thank my terrific and amazing colleague, Kimberly Brockman, who helped put together some of this analysis today. If you'll forgive me, a little bit of an advertisement. I think quite a few of you will have heard of the Tasmanian Policy Exchange, which was established really at the height of COVID to work with partners in government, community sector and industry to do analysis on the key issues that will shape Tasmania's future. And we've worked across a whole range of issues and sectors, including working with many of you in the community sector. One thing I did want to plug is that over the last couple of months, we're starting to build more of a public profile. And we've launched a policy blog called PIMBY, which is Policy in My Backyard. And regularly we do short, insightful pieces on some of the key issues that we're all grappling with. I think we've published 7 or so now. The one there that I'm highlighting is a bit of a deeper dive into cost of living pressures in Tasmania, what's driving it and how we should respond. But if you scan that code, you can access all of our blogs, and I'd encourage you to subscribe to PIMBY so that we can you can follow our work. And if any of you have got ideas in terms of issues that you think that we should be doing work on and promoting from an advocacy or an awareness point of view, feel free to reach out. The doom and gloom, the big picture kind of challenges and situation that we're confronting. Got a bit of a graphic there. It's always tempting to put a less than flattering picture of Donald Trump on the doom and gloom slide. But the reality is that we are facing increasingly uncertain times. I think perhaps the most uncertain times in the 30 or so years that I've been following politics. Clearly, we've got an ageing population in terms of demographic trends. We've got growing environmental and ecological challenges. We've got economic problems in the form of declining growth, decreasing productivity, and as we all know, the international economic outlook is really challenging and uncertain. Having said that, I remain optimistic about Tasmania, our position in the world, and our strengths. But I guess the top line there is we can't be complacent. And I guess a key message in terms of this budget analysis is more of the same just won't cut it. So our collective challenge is to work together to think about what sort of future we aspire to and how we can work in sensible ways to get there. We all saw this on Friday and over the weekend. The top line outcomes from the budget are, unprecedentedly high deficits, particularly over the next couple of years, cash deficit of up to $5 billion. And as a result of that, net debt is approaching $11 billion at the end of the forward estimates. Can we service that? Is that a sustainable amount of debt? Well, I guess one way of thinking about that is just the operating cost or the annual cost of servicing that debt. And, that's going to double over the next 4 years from 250 up to 500 million or $500 million a year just in terms of interest repayments. So clearly that's a challenge for a small state. We all follow and work follow Saul Eslake's analysis, and some of us work with him, looking at the pathway towards a surplus. If there is one, it really relies on a heroic general reining in of spending, not so much next year, but in years 2, 3, and 4 of the budget, so that it's down to about 0.3% per year, which in real terms or inflation adjusted terms is a decline in spending. The important thing to note is that the needs of the community, the momentum of programs, the political pressures that governments are under makes that almost impossible to deliver. Even coming out of the, early in the last decade, in the aftermath of the financial crisis and the budget pressures that Tasmania experienced then, we only managed to cut spending down to about 2%, and that really hurt. So, in terms of the way of characterising this budget, it's clearly kind of heroic assumptions around budget restraint without clearly explaining how they will be delivered. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the measures, and hoping that things improve down the track. In terms of the politics, what's a bit unusual about this is it kind of feels like a pre-election budget, a budget that you could conceivably buy a government another 12 months and an election, and then doing some more serious and focused reform after an election. It's a pretty curious budget to hand down 12 months into a 4-year term, if indeed the Parliament and government lasts that long. You're all familiar with that. Saul's review published last year of the structural challenges facing the Tasmanian budget's the key resource. Not quite sure about Saul's garden, but I think most of us that have been following budgets for years would agree that under these settings, returning the budget to surplus is feasible, but it's about as likely as seeing a thylacine on your front lawn when you get up tomorrow morning. So pretty unlikely. These are just expressing it in terms of charts, in terms of the budget that was handed down. Fiscal balance out to a deficit of 1.8 billion this year. Then with these general savings provisions coming down to around 400 million. On the right of that chart is the cumulative debt that we're accumulating. Key point there is, part of the explanation of governments around the world is that our debt situation is a consequence of COVID. That's where we started accumulating debts, and I think all of us would agree that the support measures and spending associated with COVID was entirely appropriate. But as you can see on that right-hand chart, our debts actually accelerated in the aftermath of COVID. So it's really only a small part of the explanation. Where do we spend our money? As you know, increasingly it's health and education are the main games in town. 34% in health, 23% in education. That's important because we've got this kind of convenient but problematic argument that we're going to achieve efficiency dividends and rein in spending without affecting frontline services. The reality is that health and education and frontline services are such a huge part of what state governments can and must and should deliver, is that it's very, very difficult to achieve savings, without touching on those key areas. Come back to health in a second. We're going to share these slides and make them available. But one thing I wanted to, and this is perhaps a new insight, is to think about where spending patterns are changing. I started my academic career about 25 years ago, and my first boss actually was a serious budget nerd, policy wonk. He actually published a history of the Federal Department of Finance. I don't think it was a bestseller. But what I learned from John Wanner was, forget the press releases, forget the budget speech, forget where money's being spent in the current year, but look at where there's change. Which programs are expanding, which ones are declining, because that says something about what the priorities of government are. It's a bit like Bob Woodward and Watergate, follow the money. So what we've done here is look at percentage changes in spending by different categories between this year and the end of the forward estimates. One thing we do need to be careful of, and this is a big caveat, is that sometimes the forward estimate spending forecasts are a bit uncertain because they depend on federal funding coming through. Kind of takeaway is that state budgets are actually often more difficult to interpret than other budgets, because particularly in Tasmania's case, because the lion's share of the money is coming from elsewhere. Nonetheless, if we look at the left of that if we look at the left of the left-hand chart, what the red line suggests is what sort of growth we need to maintain real funding, or that's factoring in inflation. One of the general, well, the big thing to take away is that the big expense item that's growing rapidly are borrowing costs. So in 4 years' time, our borrowing costs are going to increase by 80%, and that's just the flip side of that growing deficit. Had the discussions about public sector staff cuts. We're still expecting public sector salary increases to increase by about 6% in absolute terms, and a modest decline in real terms. The one that jumped out for us in terms of thinking about the community sector is the line item around grant and subsidy expenses. That's about $2.4 billion this year. It's where most of the grant funding comes through. And it is interesting that in terms of the forward estimates and therefore the savings, that is forecast to decline by about 20% or around 500 million, from 2.4 billion down to 1.9. So that's a risk and a concern, and I think we should be asking the government questions about that. Part of the explanation is there might be large federal programs that are currently in the system that aren't locked in or might not be there in 2028, 29. We started looking at this yesterday, didn't really come up with any clear answers. But I guess the second takeaway for all of you is we need to advocate, you need to be really vigilant when grant funding is coming up for renewal over the next 2 or 3 years, because there's going to be a lot of pressure to rein that in to achieve those incremental savings. Hopefully, the government would say, I think, without creating a major sort of fuss or issue. Stephen, question.
Sorry, Richard, I don't want to interrupt your flow. Hi, everyone. Stephen from TasCOSS. Just a couple of questions about these two slides. One, the red line, what does that indicate at around 12%?
Yeah, so that's our estimate of what real costs would be. So basically the argument is that you would want, if you're thinking of assuming that inflation's 2.5%, it has come down, that spending in 28, 29 should be 12.5% higher, and that's the red line, approximately, to indicate that real funding is being maintained. So as you can see, in the right-hand chart, education and health are increasing, and every treasurer every year, talks about record spending on health. Well, that doesn't mean anything. And if there's not record spending in health in subsequent years, it means that the real funding is actually declining pretty significantly. So even health and education, I think education was a bit of a winner. Their forecast spending is not expected to keep up with inflation. So you can see by area in that right-hand chart. One other caveat, we need to be careful with all of this, is the housing forecast is really around housing services. It's not the equity investment in Homes Tasmania. But even so, we can see housing and transport, at this stage are declining. Haven't focused on so much on the business, environmental, land and other portfolios. But if you look at the changes over big parts of government spending, predictably there's modest increases, probably not keeping up with inflation, and in some areas fairly significant cuts. And I won't talk about it at length. It's interesting to see how, essentially the Climate Office, for example, is being defunded, in 12 months' time.
In that category, social protection, what have you included in that?
So that's, should actually have the table and chart. The table. Under national budget reporting outcomes, rather than organising spending by agency and program, they've got to do it by purpose. and social protection, is essentially social services and social programs. And if you go back to this slide, social protection as defined in that way is around $700 million a year, or 7% of spending. So that's forecast to come off a bit. So that we need to be careful about promoting that as a kind of headline finding because of that pipeline effect, but it is worth looking at the patterns of change. I'll be quick on this one, but again, because you've probably seen most of it, but a few comments in terms of looking at a slightly more detailed analysis of budget by sector, but not too detailed. First one is infrastructure. Iron law of politics. Politicians love infrastructure spending and high-vis vests and building stuff and opening it. I did note that with my search function, infrastructure is mentioned 270 times in the main budget paper. Sustainable infrastructure spending is important to maintain our roads, buildings, physical infrastructure. And you just need to look at countries and governments that are doing it really hard. And I guess the UK comes to mind, where clearly public infrastructure is in decline as a result of austerity and then Brexit. So we do need to spend on infrastructure. In terms of the budget, around 6.2 billion over the forward estimates, and that includes both direct spending and also equity spending and things like Homes Tasmania and Macquarie Point. Decent chunks of that money come from the Commonwealth and flow through to Tasmania. Interesting, and this is the trend in the budget, infrastructure spending peaking at 1.6 billion next year and then declining in the absence of new federal funding. A couple of other observations about infrastructure is it's important, but I don't think the economic benefits are that great, particularly in Tasmania, because we're really constrained by our construction workforce. This is why the state government for years has actually had trouble spending the money it wants to on infrastructure projects. It can't get the money out the door. And big infrastructure projects like the Bridgewater Bridge and, dare I say, the stadium, or even energy projects, actually rely on a massive fly-in, fly-out workforce. So there are some local employment benefits, but I don't think they're nearly as great as proponents suggest. Given budget pressures, it's inevitable that our infrastructure spend will have to decline. So it is so important that our infrastructure maximises both social and economic, benefits, and we're really rigorous and robust about that. And as we, I think, can all agree, for both economic and social reasons, the infrastructure that we need to do so much better on is around housing, and also transport and public transport to improve accessibility for all Tasmanians. So high level kind of take on infrastructure. Won't go into health, although it is just so important, other than saying there weren't a whole bunch of huge new initiatives. Even in health, there was extra funding to reduce elective surgery, but overall portfolio spending is only increasing by 2.4% a year. Health inflation's running at 4%, and health spending by most governments has been running at 6%. So clearly that's going to be really, without significant reform or investing in preventive health and other strategies, that's going to be, really optimistic and difficult to achieve. Announce a new preventive health strategy, not much funding in the budget or public health this year, but I think that's going to be part of the budget process next year. And Adrian and I and Stephen were just talking about an audit office report published last year around health services and health service reform. And clearly, given our ageing population and growing need, any structural reform to the state budget, needs to focus on health, and it's just not clear how that's going to play out. Education, I think, is a better story. Great commitment to literacy targets, and through that Better Schools funding partnership with the Commonwealth, there's a commitment to increasing state and Commonwealth funding so that all schools meet that strategic resourcing standard for 2026, plus upgrades in terms of school infrastructure. I have been involved with and a fan of that youth job strategy in terms of trying to connect education, training and employment in strategic ways. I think is hugely important on a whole range of different levels. Housing, I'm just looking at time, I want to speed up a bit, but we're nearly there. The Tasmanian housing strategy continues. There's an additional $500 million in equity for Homes Tasmania in terms of its 10-year program through to 2032. Seems to be increased grant funding, and I'm sure some of you on the call are involved with this on the Social Housing Accelerator and Housing Support Program. But as we all know, and thanks to TasCOSS for preparing and launching the dashboard, we're running to stand still. The housing situation continues to deteriorate. 5,000 Tasmanian families on the waiting list, and a 45% increase in homelessness. You all know that we need to do better. It's frustrating. We've been talking about this for nearly 10 years. There have been some good initiatives, but we've done nowhere near enough. I also think that the review of Homes Tasmania will be important. What their role is in terms of providing homelessness services and thinking about the broader housing system, as well as obviously that important focus on community and social housing sector. This is one of the charts from some of our other works. I reckon the best measure, and thanks Kim for updating this, is just the number of homes right across the housing system we're completing per capita. Tasmania wasn't, we're the orange one. By the way, I reckon with slightly growing population, you probably want this up around 2. So nowhere in Australia is doing particularly well other than Western Australia 10 years ago. We actually did make some progress in terms of increasing completions through to 2022. But since then, partly because of interest rates and just the costs of producing housing, it's declining. Less supply, higher prices in the rental market, which is pushing people back onto the waiting list and into the social and community sector. So, challenging stuff there. Commission of Inquiry, briefly, this is a bit of a mystery. Our team were involved in terms of some of the early stages of the strategy. We've all seen that after way too long, 105 million's been committed to replacing the Ashley Youth Detention Centre. We know that a big chunk of funding set aside for the response to the Commission of Inquiry will be spent in terms of providing compensation to victims, survivors, which is entirely appropriate. Estimated, this is not spending, but the actuarial estimate, 450 million by the end of the decade. To our reading, the ongoing funding and home of Change for Children is pretty unclear. Seems to have gone from DPAC coordinating back to justice. If we go through the weeds in the budget paper number 2, there might be more programs there. I think the real concern is that the response is around compensation, which is we all agree with, but perhaps about risk management and reporting and governance rather than on systems change. And unfortunately, in terms of some of the research that our team have done, that all too often seems to be the case. If you look at child protection reforms right around the Western world in particular, is that the focus is around risk management rather than changing the system and changing culture, because that requires sustained effort and funding over a long period of time. And that effort, it tends to tends to wane or decline over time. Having said that, really like to acknowledge all of you and the sector in terms of incredibly important work, and colleagues in the public service and in government in terms of responding to the Commission of Inquiry, but needs, I think, ongoing advocacy. Maybe I won't go over social and community services. It's the main game, really. It's what we've been talking about all day. Some, modest changes there in terms of cost of living initiatives. I know at the briefing on Friday, discussion around moving towards 5-year funding agreements to provide greater continuity and certainty for service providers. The all-important question around indexation. And then beyond that, as in terms of my reading, just a small number of specific programs. And I think most of us would argue probably nowhere near enough to meet ever-increasing demand. So that's doom and gloom. Give me 5 minutes. Because one thing that academics are, I think, rightly criticised about is saying, what's wrong with the world? But as a government, as a community, as community leaders, what could we be doing differently? And, what would we do if we were treasurer for a day? And the first thing is, I think it's got on the slide there, bloody tough gig, and particularly in Tasmania in 2025. I don't think anyone would argue that our debt and deficit pathway is sustainable, and the government acknowledges that. The debate is about whether the pathway to budget repair is credible. I've mentioned in passing that unlike for national governments, economic growth is not a solution either. Economic growth is important for prosperity, employment, but it actually won't fix the budget. Why? Because in Tasmania, nearly 70% of our funding comes from elsewhere. And with a small number of state taxes, it's really only payroll tax that's credibly linked to growth. So while some governments say we're going to grow the pie and the problem will go away, and that's what Keir Starmer's trying to do in the UK, it won't work in Tasmania. So the other thing is that the general approach, which has been outlined in the budget and will be developed in the coming months, in my view, is highly problematic. There's a lot of evidence that general efficiency dividends and hiring freezes don't deliver. Sort of a budget saving by attrition, where we're trying to do the same thing, but with fewer and fewer resources. Similarly, around hiring freezes. Often when government departments or organisations are under pressure and have these staffing policies, the best staff leave. You don't have any recruiting, any new talent, any amazing graduates into programs, and outcomes really suffer. So what are the solutions? Really quickly. Whoops, what have I just done? Is that still in display mode? So one thing, and again, we'll share these slides. And
it is still in display mode, Richard. It's on productivity. Yeah,
good. Yeah. I'll wrap up in 5 minutes and then we can have a discussion. So is privatisation, or we now call it divestment, a solution? Don't think we take a ideological view on privatisation. Sometimes it does make sense, but there are some basic tests that we need to meet. Also worth noting, there have been about 150 privatisations in Australia over the last 30 years. So what are the tests? Well, is the entity to be privatised? Is there a reason why it should be government owned in terms of the services it provides? And the kind of market that it operates in. If we do privatise it, is it possible to regulate it so it remains efficient and delivers public value? And that's often really difficult. And then the financial test that, again, Saul Eslake has rightly pointed out. is you can get a short-term cash dividend from selling a business, but is it enough to effectively replace the ongoing dividends and tax equivalents that you would get from that business? And I think if you look through the list of Tasmanian entities that could be privatised, I don't think many of them meet those criteria. For example, I won't talk about Tas Networks at length. That returns around $75 million to the Tasmanian government and Tasmanian people every year. So just to recuperate that cost, the sale price has got to be north of 1.5 billion. And even then, there's a risk that what I call the kind of cash converters risk is that we just use the $1.5 or $2 billion proceeds to pay down debt without addressing the underlying problem, and we end up in the same position a few years down the track. As we know, and particularly for vulnerable, Tasmanians and citizens, there are a whole bunch of risks to privatisation. So I guess I'm saying don't rule it out there, but there'd want to be pretty serious scrutiny to ensure that that privatisation is in the long-term benefits of Tasmanians. Final one in a little bit of, we've got a slide on, is productivity. Complicated concept, often rightly maligned as just about cutting and achieving, delivering more profit and revenue with fewer resources. That's one interpretation, but there is a much more sophisticated discussion around productivity. It's often called quality adjusted productivity, where it's not just about cutting employment and making more money, but it's really asking the question, how can we sustainably maximise community well-being with limited resources? So for a whole bunch of reasons, Tasmania's productivity performance has been relatively low. I think part of a mature discussion, and both at the TPE and across UTAS, some of us have started working on this, is, how can we organise, collaborate, provide training? And this might be around the, longer term funding agreements and new models of collaboration. How can we use technology to sustain services and maximise wellbeing? And I guess the other big investment we need to make is how can we address poverty and the root causes and ultimate demand for social services. So productivity, I do think we don't want to have a knee-jerk reaction. We need to think about it, but on our terms and thinking carefully about what we're trying to achieve. So a few final thoughts. We do face huge challenges. I don't think the kind of often tried, usually failing model of just incrementally turning the screws and hoping things turn around, I don't think that's going to work in terms of budget repair. Reflecting on this, over, I guess, since Saul's budget review last year, my view is that we really need an honest conversation about what is the role and priorities of state and local government in Tasmania in the 2020s. Is it around economic development and supporting businesses? Or is it around key health, social, and educational sort of services? Should we, dare I say it, be investing, in a stadium? Most people would like one, but, is that really a priority? Is it about supporting the greyhound industry? I think we really need to think about what the priorities are and ultimately reduce the scope of what we're trying to do. Clearly, we need new models of collaboration and partnership. The community sector does that well, but between state and local government, and also with the Commonwealth. It's part of the small jurisdiction problem. I mean, a lot of our back-end services and so on could piggyback off federal systems on those enlarged states. There are smarter ways of doing things. Bugbear of mine is our incredibly complicated machinery of government, the complete incoherence of our agency structures and how they map onto ministerial portfolios. compromises accountability, good governance, and is inefficient. I just laugh, and I've got colleagues in state growth that work closely with and respect, but I think every minister in the Tasmanian cabinet is responsible to some part of state growth. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. I suspect, despite some really good efforts to coordinate, it's part of the problem with the response to the Commission of Inquiry. As always, we really need to focus on those who are most in need. Should we be, what's the role of government in terms of supporting business? Can we target our efforts and support more carefully so it really delivers? I think around energy and transport, some of the cost of living initiatives have been good, but we really haven't had the administrative systems to target them as well as they could have been. I'm a regular Metro bus catcher, and the fact that I got a half-price bus ticket, is pretty extraordinary. So we need to do better on that front. And the final one to conclude is we just need a better way of discussing these issues, don't we? We're a small state. How can we get beyond the petty politics? And a degree of that is inevitable, but how can we, I guess, going back to where I started this kind of briefing, we need a new way of setting priorities, making decisions for the long term, and we will have to change, and we do need to change, if we are going to have a more equitable and prosperous and sustainable Tasmania, because at the moment our system of decision-making and governing, which is pretty reactive and short-term, isn't working. But that's easier said than done, but I guess it's our kind of collective responsibility. So there's some broad thoughts about the budget and the challenges ahead, and just some preliminary ideas in terms of how we can perhaps work together to shape the agenda and hopefully achieve better outcomes. So I might leave it there, Adrienne, and if there are any hopefully there's some questions or comments that I'll do my best to answer.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you so much for that really comprehensive kind of overview. It's really great to also start thinking about solutions and not just how badly we're doing in a lot of different areas. And I just want to agree with you in terms of we've been really concerned about the very kind of binary debates and conversations that have been happening across the state over the last sort of 2 or 3 years in particular. It feels like very much that sort of builders and blockers conversation, and you kind of get into various camps and we're all trying to convince each other of various viewpoints, and just doesn't seem very productive or solutions focused. But just while we're waiting for some questions, I just wanted to, if you can just, I was just kind of reflecting on your comments around, particularly around the trends and changes and that area around grants and subsidies expenses. I think you said that it was declining by 20% over the forward estimates, and that what that would then mean for community service. Can you just kind of unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, look, we probably should have a look at that over the next 24 hours. So as the national budget reporting requirements, governments are required to report, and Kim might actually put up where it is in the budget papers, page 90, I don't remember, probably pull up the spreadsheet, by outcome type. And that's one that we often look at. And that big item, and it is a big item, so it's $2.4 billion. That's where, so it could come from any agency, it could come from health or justice, but in terms of by type, that's where grants and subsidies come from. So the subsidies bit might actually be assistance for business, for example. If there's a bailout of Liberty Bell Bay or something like that, it would come from that. So it's a big spending category, but it's interesting that it is, in terms of those categories, it's actually, of the big ones, over $1 billion, it actually had the largest decline. But I would like just to reiterate the caution. We didn't have a chance yesterday to make any calls or really dive into it. I mean, I think it is a question probably worth asking. It is the line item where most grant funding comes from. So It could be, and as I said, this pipeline effect that makes the state budget difficult to interpret is that if there's Commonwealth funding to the state that ends in 2027, that will be in this year's grant and subsidy expenses and next year's, but then it won't be in the final two. And if you ask ministers or treasuries, they'll say, oh, that's always the case. We don't report this in our forward estimates until we've got a new funding agreement. So there's likely to be something there. So we can't be certain, but it's worth asking the question about why is that declining? And the kind of follow-up question, I guess, is, can the state government assure the community sector that perhaps overall, in terms of the pot of money, that the real term grant funding for the community sector will be maintained in real terms over the forward estimates, and that's not clear. What this is all about, I think I mentioned it in a cliche, sort of death by a thousand cuts, is incremental tightening of the screws. It's too risky to close, restructure or close huge programs and departments, but we're just hoping that through efficiency dividends and job vacancy control, that things will keep sort of ticking along, but with less money, and there's not much evidence that that works. I can see that Tanya's got her hand up.
I do. Thank you, Richard. Yeah. It's slightly going off in a different tangent, but thank you for your presentation. Very informative, great overview. I'm just really curious to understand, in your opinion, what you think we should or could do as an industry to really hold government to account on some of these really wicked social problems. In terms of, you spoke a lot about working collaboratively and working together, and I think we do that very, very well in our sector. What outside, how can we, because what I'm sensing from government is a real lack of, I guess across the board in some instances, is valuing the role of our industry and the work we do in supporting more vulnerable members of our community. So how do we, what in your opinion, how can we get that cut through? Because I feel like it's,
Good question. I think, hey, this is probably an opportunity to cook something up. I do think we should try to, we, community sector, university, government, there are risks. We need to, I think there's a lot to be said for leaning into and trying to shape this productivity discussion. And that's what we've been thinking about over the last 6 months. Can we be proactive and, for example, longer term grant funding with appropriate accountability and reporting might be part of it, where we can think about the outcomes that we're delivering and ways of doing that, and to lean into this, government review. Adrian mentioned the audit office, review of health and social services. So maybe that's an opportunity. It's unfortunate that we're doing it under circumstances of, such tough budget conditions, because ideally it would be about maintaining and building capability and delivering more to meeting, growing needs, to really, address some of the underlying kind of causes and demands for services in terms of poverty and inclusion and equity. But at a high level, I think that's, what are the examples of where it's working? Where do we have evidence that, these really are leading to better long-term outcomes that will improve well-being and ultimately, save money? There are lots of examples of that. So a bit of a vague one, but I think that's something that we're really thinking about. I can see that my amazing colleague Kimberly's just posted the table that charts come from. Table 5.1 on page 97 of budget paper number 1. I'm sure you all studied it over the weekend, but that's what we're here for. I can also see in the chat, Donna, is there a tax revenue opportunity arising from the intergenerational wealth transfer underway? Again, it's one of the huge challenges that we're facing. And Tanya and all of those of you who work with young Tasmanians are acutely aware of this. It's not only inequality, but also the growing kind of generational edge to that, and housing affordability, as well as the labour market, are the key issues there. You know, there are some things that a state government could conceivably do, and I, for one, have done a lot of work on land taxation. Land tax isn't a panacea in terms of improving housing affordability in the short term, but at the end of the day, that can make a difference. The other area is really a Commonwealth one, and that is around inheritance tax and a much more rational and fairer way of taxing superannuation. You know, I am just stunned at the self-interested and vocal opposition, both to the franking credits debate a couple of years ago and the current policy around taxation of superannuation balances over $3 billion. Having that tax on inheritance and fairer tax on super is not only good for equity and having resources to invest in social services, it's actually good for the economy too, because inherited wealth tends to be, and this is the economic evidence, tends to be less productive, all things being equal. Donna and others, for those interested in it, my colleague at Melbourne Uni, Miranda Stewart, wrote a fantastic op-ed on why we all need to calm down in terms of the super tax debate and why it's not a big deal and it's actually good policy. Kim might be able to share that link on the chat. If not, I can send it through to Cameron and Stephen and Adrian and the team. But yeah, absolutely needs to be an issue. As a 50-something-year-old that's been fortunate enough to have pretty well paid work all of my life and benefited from cheap housing, you know, I'm part of the problem. We need to do better. I can see a question from Sarah Lindemeyer. Oh, it's almost the same question. How do you see the taxation of unrealised capital gains impacting the Tasmanian community? It's not really a big issue because a superannuation account, even if you've pushed self-managed super funds to the limit and you put your farm and all of your non-liquid, non-financial assets in it, you still need to do a capital gains reconciliation, you know, at the end of the year. So you still need to calculate that gain and report it to the tax office. Obviously, in terms of valuing property, it's a slightly less precise science. There might be a tax obligation that you need to pay, but most people, even if they've got most of their assets in property with super balances above $3 million, could probably pay a capital gains liability. If you have a capital gains loss, you can carry that forward. And if you are incredibly asset rich and cash poor and you can't meet your tax obligation, then you can enter into a payment scheme with the ATO. I mean, I think it's a bit of a red herring, having been someone who's studied and written about tax policy for way too long. So got strong views on that, but I'd refer you to Miranda's article as well.
Thanks, Richard. I'm not sure if there's any other questions coming through, but yeah, it's good to the conversation. I feel like it's the elephant in the room kind of conversation, which is the tax reform one, isn't it? And we'll see if the federal government's willing to progress some of that during this term. But clearly, there's some big conversations we need to be having at the state and federal level about what that means. And I really like your kind of comments about, you know, what is the role of state government and what should their priorities actually be. Just on the Commission of Inquiry, because I noticed that's one thing that we kind of observed was that there was some, as you said, some spends on Ashley and compensation, but very little around the sort of the other recommendations, which when we asked various officials, the comments were, oh, well, that's now become business as usual. So it's just in other sort of different departments and, you know, it's not really visible. But have you got any thoughts about that one? Because we also know that the reform team is being kind of significantly reduced. So there's some concerns that we had around that.
Yeah, look, I'd heard similar things, I guess, hold similar concerns. And I guess ultimately it's around, you know, the oversight of whether, you know, hard to measure cultural change. You know, how could we be confident that instances of child sexual abuse, either in institutional settings or in the wider community, are actually, you know, declining? And at the end of the day, that's the, you know, that's the test. You know, we've got a child and youth wellbeing framework, but you know, that's where the effort needs to be. And really interested if there's anyone on the call who's deeply involved with that. I mean, obviously Tanya, you know, is through Why Not, any views there, but I feel a little guilty that I didn't really have an opportunity to explore that. But even in budget paper number 2, we had a quick look yesterday, you know, in terms of where the you know, sort of team is within DPAC. It seems that some of that's gone to justice, and yeah, it seems to, you know, there seems to be less effort. I mean, I guess that's a claim that we've gone through the systems change and it's been mainstreamed, and that's going to deliver better outcomes. But how can we be confident of that? And is it just around risk management and reporting? So I've also heard, and probably shouldn't go into examples, where programs that your members deliver, providing support to young Tasmanians and victim survivors, you know, seems to be declining. So there's obviously a disconnect there between the rhetoric and where there's funding and the programs that are being supported. Having said that, it's not really an area of my personal sort of deep expertise, although colleagues in the team have been deeply involved with that, and with colleagues right across the university. But it's one that we need to be vigilant about.
Great. Looks like there aren't any other questions, Richard. So, and given it's 1 minute to 11, we might bring it to a close. But I just really want to thank you. I feel like we kind of, you know, we all get sort of swept up in the actual budget papers, like on Thursday and Friday. But it's good just to press pause a little bit and spend some time sort of thinking and reflecting about what do those numbers actually mean, and what can we do about it in our advocacy efforts moving forward. So yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. Ignore the budget speech, get all the media releases and recycle them, and focus on where the money is. But a pleasure to do that. We'll continue to work, you know, in terms of thinking about solutions and reform. As I mentioned at the beginning, please subscribe to our PIMBY, Policy in My Backyard, subscription, and our kind of policy blog. And if you do have ideas in terms of issues that we could explore or collaborate on from an awareness and advocacy point of view, really happy to consider that. But
and does PIMBY do presentations as well as papers? So, or is it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, as you're aware, I mean, always willing to be involved in terms of the engagement. And the other thing, we're called the Policy Exchange. I'm not sure whether that's not exactly a catching title, but we do our own kind of work, but also we connect with colleagues across the university and, you know, and draw on their expertise, and also, you know, colleagues around the country and, you know, and beyond. So, you know, our basic objective is to, you know, provide research-based kind of insights into options. Fantastic. Without being too preachy. I've been a bit preachy today, but
no, it's been great.
I apologise for that. These things are challenging, but they're not going to go away. So we need to work together to think about solutions, right?
Yeah, agree. Thanks so much, Richard. Thanks everyone for
Thanks
coming.
for the invitation. Thanks for your time, everyone.
Thank you.
And stay in touch and have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
Cheers.